The day Ethan Mercer received a stop work notice from the HOA, he thought it was just another delay in a project that had already tested his patience for months. He was building a large workshop on land he legally owned, following permits, inspections, and every county requirement. Everything should have been straightforward. Instead, the HOA president, a woman infamous throughout the neighborhood for inserting herself into everyone else's business, decided she was going to stop the construction herself. What Ethan didn't know at the time was that this would spiral into one of the most expensive mistakes the HOA had ever made. What the HOA president didn't know was even worse. Hidden behind stacks of paperwork and years of legal disputes sat a court order that gave Ethan rights the board couldn't touch. Bro, when I first heard how this unfolded, I genuinely thought there had to be more to the story. There was. And what happened next turned a routine construction project into a complete disaster for the people trying to stop it. Ethan Mercer had spent nearly 2 years preparing for the workshop. The structure wasn't some oversized commercial building or an eyesore that would dominate the neighborhood skyline. It was a practical project designed to support his custom woodworking business, something he had been building steadily for years. Every stage had been planned carefully. He hired licensed contractors, obtained county permits, completed environmental reviews, and scheduled inspections exactly as required. By the time construction crews arrived on site, Ethan believed the hardest part was already behind him. That assumption lasted less than a week. Almost immediately, complaints began appearing in his mailbox. Most weren't official notices. They were anonymous letters criticizing everything from the color of the planned exterior walls to the number of trucks entering the property. Ethan ignored them. Construction projects always attracted attention. Some people simply disliked change. Then the HOA became involved. The neighborhood association had a long reputation for aggressive enforcement, but even longtime residents admitted things had become worse after a new board president took control. She seemed determined to expand HOA authority into areas that weren't actually covered by the governing documents. Small disagreements became formal violations. Landscaping complaints turned into fines. Residents who challenged decisions often found themselves facing even more scrutiny. At first, Ethan wasn't worried. His property sat in a unique section of the community with a complicated legal history. Years earlier, before the subdivision was fully developed, ownership disputes had resulted in multiple lawsuits involving access roads, utility easements, and development rights. The cases had dragged through court for years before finally being settled. Since Ethan wasn't a lawyer, he rarely thought about those old disputes. The legal paperwork sat inside storage boxes in his office collecting dust. Unfortunately, the HOA president hadn't forgotten about his property. Within days, construction workers reported being approached repeatedly while they were working. Questions turned into demands. Demands turned into accusations. According to several crew members, someone was insisting the project violated community regulations and needed to stop immediately. The contractor contacted Ethan directly. That call was the first moment something felt seriously wrong. The contractor explained that workers were becoming uncomfortable. Deliveries were being delayed because people were questioning suppliers at the entrance. Inspectors were receiving complaints before they even arrived on site. Time was being lost every single day. Ethan attempted to resolve the issue professionally. He gathered permit copies, site plans, engineering approvals, and construction schedules. He assumed a simple review would clear up any confusion. Instead, the situation escalated. A week later, an official HOA violation notice appeared. According to the board, Ethan's workshop allegedly exceeded size restrictions, violated architectural standards, created traffic concerns, and required additional HOA approval before construction could continue. There was just one problem. None of those claims appeared to apply. Ethan reviewed the governing documents himself. Then he reviewed them again. The language was confusing in places, but one fact stood out clearly. His parcel seemed to be treated differently than most properties within the neighborhood. The more he researched, the stranger things became. Historical records showed references to grandfathered development rights. Old settlement agreements mentioned exemptions. Legal filings referenced specific court rulings tied directly to the land Ethan now owned. Bro, this was the moment the entire story changed. What started as an annoying HOA dispute was beginning to look like something much bigger. The board wasn't simply misunderstanding the rules. They appeared to be ignoring legal documents that had already been decided years earlier in court. And while Ethan was still digging through dusty files trying to understand what those documents meant, the HOA was preparing its biggest move yet, a move that would eventually cost them far more than anyone could have imagined. The situation exploded faster than Ethan expected. For only a few days after receiving the HOA violation notice, construction activity began slowing to a crawl. Suppliers started calling with concerns. Contractors reported receiving warnings that the project was under review. Some subcontractors even questioned whether they should continue working until the dispute was resolved. Every delay cost money, and the HOA seemed determined to create as many obstacles as possible. Ethan tried handling everything calmly. He submitted copies of permits, inspection approvals, engineering documents, and county authorizations. From his perspective, the facts were straightforward. The project was legal. The county had approved it. Construction had every required authorization. None of it mattered. The HOA board doubled down. Additional notices appeared. More alleged violations surfaced. New demands were added almost weekly. It felt as if every time Ethan answered one complaint, two more appeared in its place. The goal no longer seemed to be enforcing rules. It looked more like an effort to bury him in paperwork until he gave up. This part was unbelievable. One morning, Ethan arrived at the site and found construction crews standing around instead of working. A formal cease and desist letter from the HOA had been delivered to the contractor. The letter claimed the association had authority to halt the project immediately and warned that continuing construction could trigger legal action. For many contractors, that kind of threat would be enough to stop work entirely. And for a moment, it looked like the HOA had succeeded. The contractor informed Ethan that unless the legal dispute was resolved, work would likely be suspended. Thousands of dollars in scheduled labor and equipment costs were suddenly hanging in limbo. Months of planning seemed at risk of collapsing. Frustrated and running out of patience, Ethan finally did something he should have done from the beginning. He opened the old storage boxes containing the records from the property's legal history. Inside were court filings, settlement agreements, land surveys, and judicial rulings dating back years. As he worked through the paperwork, one document immediately caught his attention. Buried among hundreds of pages was a signed court order that appeared to give his property protections far beyond what the HOA was claiming. And the more Ethan read, the more he realized the board might have just made a catastrophic mistake. Ethan spent the entire weekend reviewing the documents with an attorney who specialized in property disputes. By Monday morning, the situation looked completely different than it had just a few days earlier. The court order wasn't vague. It wasn't open to interpretation. Years before Ethan purchased the property, a lengthy legal battle had ended with a judge issuing a ruling that permanently limited the HOA's authority over that specific parcel of land. The order existed because previous HOA boards had attempted similar interference during the subdivision's development. After years of litigation, the court had established clear protections to prevent exactly that behavior from happening again. Bro, when Ethan's attorney explained the implications, everything suddenly made sense. The reason the HOA documents seemed contradictory was because the court order overrode portions of them. The reason historical records kept referencing exemptions was because those exemptions had been legally enforced by a judge. Most importantly, the HOA had already been informed of these restrictions years earlier. That meant the board wasn't simply mistaken. They should have known. Armed with copies of the ruling, Ethan's attorney immediately sent a formal response demanding that the HOA withdraw every violation notice, rescind the cease and desist letter, and stop interfering with construction. 6. The letter also warned that continued obstruction could expose the association to significant financial liability. The HOA president refused. According to meeting records later uncovered, she reportedly believed Ethan was bluffing and assumed the association could pressure him into abandoning the project before any real legal consequences arrived. That decision became the turning point. Construction delays continued for several more days. More notices were issued. Additional interference was documented. Every action created another paper trail. Every communication generated more evidence. Then Ethan filed suit. The courtroom proceedings moved much faster than anyone expected because the underlying issue had already been decided years earlier. The judge reviewed the historical case, examined the existing court order, and compared it against the HOA's recent actions. The outcome was devastating for the association. The court found that the HOA had interfered with rights already protected by a prior judicial ruling. Evidence showed the board had access to records identifying the restrictions on its authority. Despite that knowledge, it continued issuing demands, threats, and enforcement actions. The judge ordered the HOA to cease interference immediately. Violation notices were voided. The stop work efforts were invalidated. Construction resumed. But the most painful part wasn't the ruling itself. Because Ethan had documented financial losses caused by the delays, legal expenses, contractor disruptions, and project interruptions, the HOA suddenly faced the possibility of paying a substantial amount of money. And as news of the court's decision spread through the neighborhood, homeowners began asking a very uncomfortable question. If the board had ignored a court order this obvious, what else had it been getting wrong? 7 In the months that followed, Ethan's workshop was completed without further interference. The HOA quietly withdrew its remaining complaints, while several homeowners demanded accountability from the board. Faced with growing criticism and legal expenses, the HOA president eventually stepped down. Meanwhile, Ethan's business expanded, and the workshop that nearly got shut down became a symbol of perseverance. What began as an attempt to stop his project ended with the HOA damaging its own reputation far more than it ever damaged Ethan's plans. Looking back, this story is a perfect reminder that authority only works when it's backed by facts. The HOA president assumed pressure and persistence would outweigh legal reality, but the court order changed everything. I genuinely couldn't believe how quickly confidence turned into consequences once the truth came out. Karma doesn't always arrive immediately, but when it does, it can be impossible to ignore. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Have you ever dealt with an HOA, difficult neighbor, or power-hungry official? Drop your experience in the comments. And stay tuned for more unbelievable stories where entitlement meets consequences.